In this video, we're going to be looking at Java functions or method calls, which provide much better ways to structure out our programs. Now, so far, all the code that we've been writing has been in our main method. However, as we write more code and our programs get longer, we're going to find that we want to structure it in a slightly more clearer way. And if we look at this code here, so we have 8 lines of code, and imagine if you had, say, 100, 150 to 200 lines of code, then as you can imagine, it would get quite long. And so what we could do is potentially space the code out, which already makes it easier to read. Or what we could do instead is use a Java function. So functions are quite simple, and what they allow us to do is essentially put a bit of code aside so that we can repeat it whenever we want without having to write it all out again. And let's take this for example. And so here we have int num1 equals 5 and int num2 equals 6, and then we're just simply adding them all up. However, if we wanted to do this with 2 different numbers but still keep the result of these two, then what it would mean is we'd have to write it all out again. However, if we use a Java function, then that saves us from doing this. And the way we do that is quite similar to how we've stated this main method. So we'll start off with public, and remember to take care when you're deciding to set it to public or private based on the level of security that you want. So for now I'm just going to set it as public, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it a static method, and what that means is it's a method that can be called by this class. And we'll come into this in further detail when we look at the difference between static and non-static methods when we come onto objects. And now I'm going to state the return type of the function. And so here we can see, well, we're taking 2 numbers and we want them to be added to give us a result. And so that's going to be a result of type int. So I'm going to say int, and then we simply just give our function a name. So I'm going to call it add. And what we want it to do is we want it to take in these 2 numbers, int num1 and int num2. And so we specify them in between these brackets, and they're what's known as parameters. So I'm going to have int num1, and then I separate them by a comma, and int num2. And what I do is the code I want to be repeated, I throw between a pair of curly braces, like we have here. So now we come on to the body of the function, and that's basically the stuff that goes inside our method or our function. And as you can see, we have a red squiggly line coming up showing an error. In this case, it's saying we're missing a return statement. And that's because here we've stated that we're going to return an int. So it's sort of a promise that you've made. And so what we can do to keep this quiet for now essentially is just say return, and that's how we sort of send the number back. And then I'm just going to put 0 in there for now. And then what we can do is simply just take this code, and I'm going to copy it and put it in here. So now that will work with any numbers, and I can essentially just say int sum is whatever this number is plus whatever this number is. So for example, I can simply get rid of this, and I can say add 5 and add 6. And then what it's going to do is it will run this function, so taking 5 as num1 and 6 as num2, because 5 is first and 6 is second, and then it will take int sum equals 5 plus 6. And then what it'll do, so right now what it'll do is return 0, and so what I actually need to do is change this to say return sum. However, another more efficient way to do this is we can actually simply take this, and what I'm going to do is copy and paste it, and we can put it there. And so what that will do is do the sum and then return whatever the result is of these 2. And so that saves us a whole lot of code, because then we can simply get rid of this, and if we wanted to add 2 more numbers, we could say int sum1, just as long as we give it a different name it's alright, equals add, say 7 and 8. And then it will also return the sum of 7 and 8. However, it's important to notice we have to put integers here, because we've specified integers here. So for example, if I try to say true is a boolean, and so it's going to give me an error. And so we can do a similar thing here, and I'm going to say public static, and then here we've got a boolean, and so what I'm going to do is static boolean, and then I'm going to give the function its name. So I'm going to call it is bigger than 10, and well, it'll be quite clear what the function does. It's just checking if something's bigger than 10. And so what we need is, well, we actually only need 1 parameter, so I'm just going to say int x to correspond to this x here, though sometimes you want your parameters to have slightly better names. And then what I'm going to do is simply just return, because I said I'm going to return again, a Boolean. And what it will be is if this parameter here, or if this number is bigger than 10. So x greater than 10. And notice I could also put it in a separate Boolean value, such as a Boolean result equals whatever x greater than 10 is, and then return result. However, that's an extra line of code, and once again, it's not as efficient. And then so what I could then do is simply get rid of these two lines of code, which saves me here, and then I can just say, well, this is equal to whatever happens when I call this function on, say, 6. And then again, we're also not restricted to our primitive types, and we can also return, say, a string. So I'm going to try that. So public static string, and then I'm going to call it concat, because we concatenate two strings, which basically means we put them together. And although we've had ints as the parameters here, we don't actually have to restrict ourselves to that. So I'm going to change it to string add1, which corresponds to this here. And then I'm also going to change this to string add2. And then I'll put the braces in again. And then what I'll simply do is, well, of course, just return string add1 plus string add2. And then what that will do is I can save a whole lot of space here, and I'm just going to call that value strings, and I can just choose to return what happens when I get concat, and then say I chose hello, and then world. Okay, and so now I've basically said that we can sort of take the code that we had here and put it into these functions here. And surely if I call a method here, then it should be able to do stuff. But if we look at our logic from previous videos, then we'll remember that the code actually executes line by line. And so surely we should get int sum1 here, and then it should go here before it runs to this method here. And what it's actually doing is we can actually alter the control flow like we did with our if and while statements. And what we do is we have our add statement, or our add method, and putting the name of the method here sort of jumps to this method here. And then what it will do is it will execute the code in this method and then jump back. So we're sort of still going line by line by line by line, but then we're also taking detours, so jumping to our code and then coming back, and then jumping to our code and then coming back again. And so we should also remember that the code that gets executed is only the code that's in the main method. So for example, if I commented these two lines out, then these are the only two lines which make a call to my add method. And so that add method would actually not get used. And here we can actually say, see, IntelliJ is telling us that this method will never get used. And so what we need to remember is that it's only the lines in the main method that will actually get called. And if we have nothing in our main method, we can have a million lines of code outside of it. Nothing's going to happen when we run our program. And so a further note based on that is I also spoke about having our return types and how they can be any of the primitive types or a Boolean. Well, we can actually have a return type which returns nothing. And so that's called void, which is actually what we have here. So it's literally follows the same principle. So public static void, which means nothing. And then what I'm going to call this method is printing. And I'm just going to get it to print some statements. And so here, if you notice, I'm actually not giving any parameters. And that's because we don't actually have to. And so then I'm going to do system.out.println. And then what I'm going to do is get it to print hello. And so now if I was to call this method, so what would happen is my lines of code would be executed, and then it would get to this, and it wouldn't actually return anything or store anything in a variable like we've had in these situations, but it would just print out the word hello. And also another thing to notice is, say I put in, say, string hi, then if you see, we've actually got an error. And that's because it's really important to note that when we're defining our parameters and we're calling our methods, we have to call it with the exact same number of arguments that the method is defined with here. So here it has 0 arguments, and so we define it with 0. Here it's got 2 int arguments, and so we would define it with 2 ints. And here, for example, it had 1, and so we defined it with 1. And so if you don't call it like this, then it's not going to run. And so that's an overview of methods and functions. And as you can see, they're actually quite useful to separate our code out, and makes it much easier when we want to debug our code in the future. And as usual, all the code for my video will be posted in my Git repository in the link below. So I hope you've enjoyed the content, and please do like, share, and subscribe.